Canada is the second largest country on Earth, but most people only see a handful of postcards from it. The CN Tower, Banff's Blue Lakes. What nobody sees is what is sitting under the water. Somewhere under one of Alberta's most photographed lakes sits a Victorian resort town, hotel windows still in their frames, 60 feet down. Somewhere in British Columbia is a graveyard that keeps giving its dead back. And somewhere in the north, a mountain trench filled so fast overnight that families ran for high ground in the dark. In Ontario, 10 whole towns went under in 4 days on a fixed schedule on the country's own birthday. That is number 1 on this list, and once you hear what locals still call that day, you will understand why we saved it for last. This is the channel that digs up the parts of Canada nobody put on a postcard. Subscribe if you have not already, because we post stories like this every week. Today we are counting down 10 Canadian towns that went underwater on purpose. Let's get into it. Number 10. Minnewanka Landing. The resort you can only visit with scuba gear. Lake Minnewanka sits inside Banff National Park, one of the most photographed lakes in the country, ringed by peaks and full of tour boats. Almost none of those tourists know there's a town underneath their cruise. Minnewanka Landing opened as a lakeshore resort in 1888, and it grew into a real summer village. Hotels, restaurants, cottages, wharves, cruise boats of its own. 2 smaller dams in 1895 and 1912 had already nudged the water up a little. Then came the Second World War, and Calgary needed power. Under the War Measures Act, which overrode the normal protections of the National Parks Act, a much bigger dam went up in 1941. It raised the lake by roughly 30 meters. The entire town, an earlier dam, and a bridge over Devil's Creek all went under at once. Here's the thing. Because the water is glacial, close to freezing, the town never really rotted. It froze in place. Divers who go down today report swimming past cottages with the window glass still sitting in the frames, 60 feet under an aquamarine lake that 8,000 people dive every single year, most of them with no idea what they are actually swimming through. The Stoney Nakoda name for this lake is Minnewanka, Lake of Spirits, and that name predates the resort by centuries. It is one of the best preserved submerged villages in the country, and it sits directly under one of Canada's busiest tourist lakes. Most of the people paddling across it have no idea they are floating over someone's front porch. Number 9. Boat Encampment. The explorer's post that drowned. In January 1811, the explorer David Thompson led a Northwest Company party to a bend in the Columbia River, so sharp it doubles back on itself, and there he built cedar canoes to run the river. He called the place Boat Encampment. It became a Hudson's Bay Company trading post, and in 1943 the federal government made it a National Historic Site. Here's the wild part. 30 years later, the government drowned its own historic site. Canada signed the Columbia River Treaty in 1961, committing to build storage dams for flood control and power, and Meeka Dam was the biggest of them. When the reservoir behind it filled in 1973, the meadow where Thompson had lashed together his canoes went under, along with a scatter of small settlements around the Big Bend. Downey, LaPorte, Big Bend, Mica, Beavermouth. British Columbia's own place names registry recorded the ending in one flat sentence. The name Boat Encampment was officially rescinded on March 11, 1974, due to flooding of Kinbasket Lake behind Meeka Dam. Before the water came, someone had to unbolt the historic marker and carry it to higher ground. A new memorial plaque was eventually placed on the south shore of the Columbia in 2000. What is left is the reservoir itself, a long fluctuating lake through a deep mountain trench, largely empty of traffic away from its 2 ends. At low water, old stumps and bare ground still surface across the flats where the Big Bend used to be. A government commemorated this place as historically important, then flooded it anyway, and had to move the plaque to dry land to keep commemorating it. Number 8. Minto City. The gold town turned prison camp, then drowned. Minto sat where the Bridge River meets Gun Creek, laid out around 1930 as a model gold mining town by a promoter with big plans. The gold never really came through, and by 1940 the town was mostly empty houses. Then came Pearl Harbor. Canada declared its coastal Japanese-Canadian population a security threat, forced them from their homes under the War Measures Act, and needed places to put them. Minto's empty miners' cottages became one of the region's self-supporting internment sites. About 24 families, roughly 325 people, were relocated there, and out of rocky, unpromising soil, they grew flower and vegetable gardens that locals still talk about. After the war, the families scattered and Minto emptied out again. A flash flood on Gun Creek wrecked much of what was left around 1949 and 1950. Then BC Electric's Bridge River Hydro Project dammed the valley for good, and through the 1950s, the rising Carpenter Lake Reservoir swallowed Minto along with its neighbors, Rexmount, Wayside, and Congress. Here's the detail that stops people cold. The same buildings that had once held families forced from the coast under a wartime emergency measure were, a decade later, erased by an entirely different government project for an entirely different reason. Nothing about that was accidental either time. Today, at low reservoir levels, the old street grid, building foundations, and the route of the original Bridge River Road resurface out of the mud. A faint outline of a town that was first a mining camp, then a prison, then a lake bed. A place built to hold people against their will got flooded anyway, like the water wanted the last word. Number 7. Oedian on the Guin Reservoir. The meeting place at the bottom of the lake. This one predates almost everything else on this list. Lake Oedian in Quebec's Haute-Mauricie region had been an Atikamekw gathering and trading place for centuries, sitting on canoe routes that connected all the way to Lac Saint-Jean and James Bay. The Hudson's Bay Company set up a post there in 1825. Between 1916 and 1918, the Shawinigan Water and Power Company built the La Loutre Dam, later renamed the Guin Dam, to regulate the St. Maurice River for power and for floating timber to the mills downstream. When the reservoir filled, it drowned hundreds of lakes at once, Lake Oedian among them, taking the old village and its archaeological sites under with almost no compensation, and for years, almost no real explanation to the people who lived there. Canada's Specific Claims Tribunal now refers to this simply as the 1918 flood. The Atikamekw rebuilt about 3 kilometers to the west in 1925 on the site of the Oedian or Opichewan community that still stands today. Here's what makes this one different. This flooding happened 40 years before the Seaway, decades before anyone in this country was even planning the bigger dams still to come. At the time, the Guin Reservoir was the largest artificial lake in the world. What is there now is a living community of more than 2,000 people on the reservoir's north shore, and beneath the water around it, a drowned village and drowned lake that predate the name most people know for Canadian hydro projects by a full generation. The claim went to a federal tribunal 100 years after the water rose. Some floods take a century to even get acknowledged. Number 6. Chemawawin, once known locally as the Old Post. The community moved to bedrock. Chemawawin sat at the mouth of the Saskatchewan River, where it meets Cedar Lake in northern Manitoba, an 80-year-old Cree community by the time anyone came asking for the land. In 1962, Manitoba Hydro needed Cedar Lake as the forebay for its new Grand Rapids Dam, built between 1960 and 1968. The Chemawawin Cree Nation was asked to surrender its territory, and under what became known as the Forebay Agreement, the community relocated to a new planned town site called Easterville on the lake's south shore. Here's the thing nobody planned for. Easterville sat on bare bedrock. No soil for gardens, no ground for trapping or farming, houses built on concrete slabs because there was no earth to dig a basement into. The flooding itself raised Cedar Lake by roughly 3.5 meters and put around 500,000 acres underwater, taking farmland, wildlife habitat, and an ancient burial ground along with it. A monument now stands on an island in Cedar Lake, bearing the names of the people whose graves went under the reservoir. It is, in effect, a headstone for a cemetery nobody can visit anymore. The community that rebuilt at Easterville still lives there today, still Cree, still connected to Cedar Lake, but disconnected from the land that used to sustain them. Compensation disputes between trappers and Manitoba Hydro have dragged on for decades, well into recent years. They traded a homeland for a town site, and the town site turned out to be rock. Before we get to the second half of this list, if you are finding these stories interesting, drop a thumbs up and let us know in the comments which of these communities surprised you the most. We read every single one. Every single We have covered floods that are 70, even 100 years old so far. The next one happened less than a decade ago. Number 5. Mud Lake, the town the new dam flooded in 2017. Everything else on this list happened in black and white, or close to it. This one has cell phone footage. Mud Lake is a small Labrador community of around 40 people, sitting on the lower Churchill River near Happy Valley Goose Bay. On May 17, 2017, shortly after the Muskrat Falls Dam came online, the community was flooded. Muskrat Falls had been sold as a nation-building megaproject for Newfoundland and Labrador. What it actually delivered was a cost overrun that took the price from around $7.4 billion at the 2012 estimate to more than $13 billion. Badly enough that a former premier called it the worst economic mistake in the province's history. Reservoir impoundment for the project was completed in 2019, eventually flooding about 41 square kilometers to create a 101 square kilometer reservoir. Downstream, the project also raised real concerns about methyl mercury contamination for indigenous communities relying on the river. Here's what makes this one different from everything else on this list. The residents of Mud Lake did not accept it quietly and move on. They launched a class action lawsuit against the Crown Corporation behind the project, and years later, that fight is still going through the courts. Every other flood on this list is a piece of history. This one still has an open file number. Number 4. Finley Forks and Fort Graham, now under Williston Lake. The night the trench filled with water. The Rocky Mountain Trench in northern British Columbia was the heart of Sakani, or Chicane territory, where the Finley and Parsnip rivers came together. In 1968, the WAC, Bennett Dam, was completed on the Peace River, at the time the largest dam in the Western world, and Premier WAC. Bennett bragged it would change the climate of the North. What it actually did was fill the trench. Williston Lake reached its full level by 1973, covering about 1,761 square kilometers, making it the largest body of fresh water in British Columbia, and by volume, the 7th largest reservoir on the planet. It buried the Sakani settlements of Finley Forks, Fort Graham, and Encampment. Elders described the water rising overnight in 1968, fast and largely without warning, forcing families onto higher ground in the dark. Trap lines, gathering sites and burial grounds, went under with the villages. Fort Graham Cemetery was flooded outright. The graveyard at Encampment Point had to be moved inland to escape the rising water. Community accounts put the number of people who drowned in the aftermath at around 9, though that figure comes from oral history rather than an official count. Here's the detail that stops people cold. When the dam later drew the lake down by 9 meters one winter, wind picked up the exposed silt and turned it into dust clouds so thick that the community below was invisible from the air, a problem that has never fully gone away. The Tseke Dene and Kwadacha nations were forced onto reserves at the edges of a lake too dangerous and debris-choked for the flat-bottomed riverboats they had always used. In 2006, more than 3 decades after the flooding, British Columbia and BC Hydro reached a settlement worth roughly $14 million plus ongoing annual payments. $14 million, 38 years later, for a homeland that still shows up as open water on every map made since. Number 3. Arrowhead and the villages of the Arrow Lakes. The valley they burned before they drowned it. Before the water came, they set fire to the valley. The Columbia River Treaty of 1961 obligated Canada to build storage dams for the Americans downstream, and the Arrow Lakes Valley in British Columbia's West Kootenay was chosen to flood, with barely any consultation of the people who actually lived there. Through the 1960s, BC Hydro cleared the valley bottom. Some communities were moved up above the new water line. Others were erased outright. And as the reservoir prepared to rise, crews burned homes to the ground rather than deal with them. Photographs from the clearance survive. One shows a woman named Rose Roan sitting calmly in front of her own house while it burns behind her in the community of Renata. Another shows the Anglican Church of St. John the Divine, unmoored and adrift on a barge in the middle of Upper Arrow Lake. A church quite literally set afloat rather than left to be swallowed where it stood. When the Hugh Keenleyside Dam closed in 1968, it raised the water level by roughly 36 feet and joined the upper and lower Arrow Lakes into a single 230-kilometer reservoir. One now managed to meet power needs on the other side of an international border. About 2,000 people across the valley were displaced from Arrowhead, Renata, Burton, East Arrow Park, Sidmouth, and a place simply called 12 Mile. Apart from its cemetery, Arrowhead itself went entirely under the water. The steamboat era that had defined the valley for generations ended quietly in 1954 when the stern-wheeler SS Minto made her final run out of the Arrowhead docks. What is left today is a long, still lake threading between the Selkirk and Monashee Mountains, with Arrowhead Cemetery standing above the waterline as the last visible trace of a whole town. In drought years, when the reservoir drops low enough, old stumps and bare townsite ground reappear along the shore, like the valley remembering out loud what used to be there. They burned it, floated the church away, and then let an entire valley disappear underwater, controlled by a country that isn't even this one. Number 2. Cheslatta, on the Nechako watershed near the Kenny Dam. The graves that won't stay buried. On April 3, 1952, the Cheslatta Carrier Nation was told they had roughly 2 weeks to leave. British Columbia had entered a massive partnership with the Aluminum Company of Canada the year before, agreeing to dam the Nechako River and reverse its flow through the mountains to power a new aluminum smelter at Kitimat. When engineers realized the Kenny Dam would block the local salmon run, their solution required flooding the Cheslatta villages as well. The community's demands for fair compensation, land, pensions, and new roads to reach what reserves would survive were dismissed by officials as, in their own words, fantastic and unreasonable, definitely out of the question. So the Cheslatta left. Behind them, their homes were burned. Eventually, so was their Catholic church, the one building the community had built with their own hands. On October 8, 1952, the Kenny Dam blocked the Nechako, and water backed up for more than 200 kilometers, forming a reservoir of roughly 900 square kilometers that flooded almost 400 square kilometers of Cheslatta territory. About 60 graves went under with it. Here's the wild part, and it is not really wild at all, it is just brutal. These are not ancient graves. Some of the people buried there died in 1952. Relatives of the dead are still alive. Because of decades of erratic, poorly managed water releases through the reservoir's spillway, flooding and erosion have continued ever since, and Cheslatta members still find human remains washing up along the shore, remains they collect and rebury themselves again and again. In 2012, Rio Tinto Alcan returned somewhere between 11 and 12,000 acres of land to the nation. In 2019, the Cheslatta Carrier Nation signed a formal reconciliation and settlement agreement with the province 67 years after the eviction. The Cheslatta Carrier Nation still lives on relocated and returned land today, still doing restoration work on a territory that keeps giving up its dead every time the water rises. 2 weeks' notice in 1952 to make room for a smelter. 70 years later, the bones are still coming back. Number 1. The Lost Villages. Picture standing in shallow, clear water near Cornwall, Ontario on a calm summer day, looking straight down. Below you, a sidewalk. A stone foundation, still square at the corners. The outline of a street running off into darker water where the sunlight stops reaching. A diver drifts past a masonry wall dating to the 1790s, and it is still standing, upright, exactly where it was built. There is no debris field here, no wreckage, just a town, laid out block by block, sitting quietly at the bottom of a river that was made to cover it. 10 communities used to stand here: Mille Roche, Moulinet, Dickinson's Landing, Wales, Farrens Point, Altsville, and the smaller hamlets of Maple Grove, Santa Cruz, Woodlands, and Sheik's Island. Many were founded in the 1780s and 1790s by United Empire Loyalists. About 6,500 people called them home. The St. Lawrence Seaway was supposed to be one of the great engineering achievements of the century, deepening the river so ocean freighters could reach the Great Lakes while a new power dam supplied electricity to both countries. Raising the river to make that happen meant flooding this whole stretch of shoreline, on purpose, on a schedule. Residents protested fiercely. It did not matter. Through the mid-1950s, crews jacked up and hauled roughly 530 buildings to 2 brand new towns built to receive them, Longsaw and Ingleside. Everything else, homes, schools, businesses, was simply demolished. Then came July 1st, 1958. Locals still call it Inundation Day. At 8 o'clock that morning, engineers detonated a cofferdam, reportedly with around 27 tons of explosives, and the St. Lawrence was allowed to do the rest. Within 4 days, every one of the 10 town sites was completely underwater. A stretch of Provincial Highway 2 went under with them and had to be rebuilt along higher ground. It happened deliberately on Canada's 91st birthday. Here's the signature detail that stops people cold every time. This was not an accident, a war measure, or a slow, reluctant relocation stretched over years. Engineers picked a date, picked an hour, counted down, and pushed a button. 10 towns went from standing to underwater in 100 hours flat, and the people who lived through it still mark the anniversary every single Canada Day. What remains today is the Lost Villages Museum, holding what could be salvaged, and a memorial wall built from relocated headstones near Upper Canada Village, so the dead at least have a marker somewhere above the water. The submerged roads and building foundations are still visible from the air on a clear day, and divers explore them every summer, swimming down streets that were laid out for horse carts and are now laid out for scuba fins. 300 years of settlement, 6,500 lives uprooted, in 10 towns erased on a fixed schedule, because a country needed a bigger river more than it needed those particular streets. Canada built more reservoirs across the 20th century than most people will ever realize, and this list barely scratches the surface of what is sitting under all that water. For me, it's Cheslatta. A community given 2 weeks to pack, and 70 years later their ancestors' bones are still coming back with every flood. That one does not leave you. Tell us in the comments which of these towns you had never heard of before today, or if we missed one near you. If you want more of the parts of this country nobody put on a postcard, subscribe, because there is always another drowned town waiting to be found.